Welcome to the Iran 1400 Project podcast, where we explore the past, present, and possible futures of Iran through informed dialogue, independent thought, and diverse voices. From historical insight to emerging narratives, we connect ideas to action in the pursuit of a more just, inclusive, and forward-looking society. Join us as we rethink Iran's trajectory, one conversation at a time.
Today we're diving into something really fascinating: the evolution of Iran's civic, political, and economic societies. Our main source is an article by Vafa Mostahim. It's actually a review of Aram Hassami's book, 2-3 words.
And this article gives us a really useful framework, kind of like looking at different layers of society. It explores this idea of Iranian citizenry and whether it could, bridge some deep divides.
So our mission today is to unpack that framework. We'll trace how these three spheres, civic, political, economics, have changed over the last century or so.
And really tackle that central question the author raises. Can a shared civic identity, one based on dignity, responsibility, participation, can that actually help overcome all the distrust and fragmentation we see?
And crucially, how does this look different inside Iran versus, say, among Iranians living abroad?
That inside-outside dynamic is key.
Yeah, because grasping these different parts, how they connect, how they clash, that's really crucial for understanding modern Iran. It's not just one thing, is it?
Not at all. It's these different layers, sometimes working together, often in tension.
And understanding that sheds light on the complexities, the hopes, the struggles of people wherever they are. So stick with us. We're going to try and unpack all of this for you.
Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's jump right into the core idea from Hassami's book as the article presents it. The main point is, to really understand Iranian society, you kind of need to look at it through three lenses.
Right. Three dynamic spheres: civic, political, and economic. Distinct, but always interacting.
And the big question the author digs into is whether this concept of Iranian citizenry, a shared identity based on dignity, responsibility, participation, can it actually unify these often quite fragmented parts?
Yeah, can it be a common thread? And the article's approach is to look back, to trace how each sphere evolved over the past 100 years or so, to see if that kind of convergence is even plausible now.
Makes sense. So let's take them one by one, starting with civic society.
Okay.
The article points out it has really deep roots inside Iran, going all the way back to the constitutional revolution in 1906.
That's right. You had these independent Anjuman-ha, sort of like local associations, guilds, professional groups, plus independent newspapers, educational groups, all kind of emerging with this shared aim of holding power accountable, building community structures outside the state's direct grip.
But then under the Pahlavis, things change.
Yeah, those emerging civic groups faced big challenges. The state often tried to, co-opt them or just suppress them entirely. But even with that pressure, things like urbanization were creating new players, students, professionals, technocrats forming their own networks, still pushing for some space to participate.
And post-1979 revolution, there was a big civic mobilization initially, wasn't there?
Huge mobilization. But then pretty quickly, the new regime moved to control or clamp down on independent associations again. But here's what the article really stresses: the resilience. Despite everything, you still have professional unions, student groups, women's networks, local charities. They found ways to persist.
How do they operate now?
Often informally, creatively, and frankly, often taking huge risks on the ground. They're still there.
Okay, now shifting focus. What about civic society outside Iran, in the diaspora?
Well, its emergence was largely a direct consequence of that repression inside. People left, especially after '79, heading to North America, Europe.
And they built new structures.
Exactly. Independent Persian language media, human rights groups, academic networks, cultural initiatives. Really vital work focused on preserving memory, fostering free expression, building community in exile.
So this diaspora civic society, it acts as a kind of mirror, maybe, an amplifier.
Absolutely. Giving voice to those inside who can't speak freely or face immense risks. They organize petitions, do research, run solidarity campaigns across borders.
And technology must have played a huge role here.
Oh, a total game changer. Platforms like YouTube, Twitter, Clubhouse, They've turned these dispersed communities into virtual civic spaces, connecting Iranians globally in real time.
But the article points out some limitations too, right, for the diaspora civic groups.
It does, and this is crucial. They face different constraints, things like fragmentation, ideological rivalries, and maybe most importantly, just the physical distance from the day-to-day reality inside Iran.
So while they shape narratives, support causes,
they remain institutionally detached from the grassroots organizing, the actual risk-taking happening inside. It's a different kind of engagement.
So this idea of civic citizenship as a unifier, the article suggests it depends on bridging that gap between inside and outside experiences.
Precisely. Shared values and memory are important, yes, but true convergence needs more. It needs ways to connect the experience of living under constraint with the experience of, speaking freely but from afar.
It sounds like it requires empathy, accountability, coordination.
That's exactly the author's point. It's not just about doing similar things in parallel. It's about connecting those two realities somehow.
Okay, let's shift gears. Let's talk about the political society.
Right.
Inside Iran, the article traces its modern start back to that same period, the Constitutional Revolution, 1905-1911.
Yeah, this was when ideas like parliamentary government, rule of law, the state being accountable to the people, these were first really debated and put on the table. Groundbreaking stuff at the time.
But that didn't last unchallenged.
No, political pluralism really eroded under the Pahlavis, especially after the 53 coup against Mossadegh.
Right, I remember reading about that.
And while they pushed modernization, infrastructure, education, bureaucracy, it happened within an increasingly centralized authoritarian system.
How did that work in practice?
Well, the state used surveillance, banned independent parties, elections became more symbolic, let's say, less real choice.
So the effect was people had less political agency, less trust.
Exactly. Popular agency shrank, and trust in the formal political system really diminished over time.
Then came the 1979 revolution, a rebirth of political society.
Initially, yes, with massive mobilization. But the system that emerged is, well, the article calls it a complex hybrid.
Hybrid, how so?
You have elected bodies, like the parliament and president, but then you also have powerful unelected bodies, the supreme leader, the guardian council.
Okay.
Which creates this kind of dual sovereignty, as the author puts it. And that structure inherently limits real political competition. It's led to a lot of disillusionment.
There were reform efforts, though, weren't there? Like under Khatami.
Yes, there were openings. But the system consistently struggled to deliver sustained reform. And then you had the crackdowns on protests.
Now the 2019.
2022 more recently. Each time increasingly violent. This has just deepened the crisis of legitimacy.
So the article suggests that for many inside, the formal political structures feel kind of empty.
Hollowed out, yeah. Like the real paths for making change are blocked.
Okay, so what about political activity outside Iran? In the diaspora?
That's been a constant for decades now. Since '79, you've seen a whole spectrum of opposition groups, parties in exile, lobbying organizations, advocacy coalitions.
And they use political language.
Oh, absolutely. I talk about regime change, transitional government, constitutional reforms. That's the language they adopt.
But the article points out a key limitation again.
A huge one. They operate fundamentally without being close to the state they want to change. They don't have the mechanisms inside Iran to actually implement their proposals.
Right. No power base on the ground in that sense.
Exactly. And this leads to what the author calls the illusion of political agency for some diaspora groups.
Illusion of agency. That sounds harsh.
It's a provocative phrase. The idea is, while they frame themselves as political actors demanding policy changes, their lack of accountability to people inside Iran and their lack of real power to make things happen there means they often function more like civic voices, using political words.
So loud voices may be influential in international circles?
Yes, some are effective lobbyists, but fundamentally disconnected from the domestic political machinery that actually governs daily life inside.
And the article mentions internal issues too, rivalries.
Yes, internal rivalries, ideological rigidity, a lack of strategic unity. These have consistently hampered the diaspora's ability to present a united, credible alternative.
So their activity is real, but
it lacks that institutional embeddedness you need for a functioning political society within a country.
Okay. So the tough conclusion here, according to the article, is that real political change, rebuilding trust, that has to come from the ground up, inside Iran.
That seems to be the author's perspective. Bottom-up participation, accountable structures, citizen-led negotiation happening inside.
And the diaspora's role is supportive, but not.
It's not substitutive. Crucial for support, analysis, advocacy, yes. But it can't replace the internal process in this sphere.
Right. Okay, let's move to the third sphere, the economic society. The article says this has always been really central in Iran.
Absolutely fundamental. Historically, the power center was the bazaar.
The bazaar. We think of it as just a market, but it was more.
Much more. It was a social, moral, communal hub, deeply tied to religious endowments, civic norms, merchants' guilds. They held real economic and social influence, a powerful force.
And the Pahlavi era shook that up too, with modernization.
Big time. Top-down push for industrialization, centralized state planning, power shifted away from the traditional bazaar structures.
That create inequality.
It often did. Land reforms, state industries. They spurred growth, sure, but disrupted old networks and often widened the gap between rich and poor. And crucially, getting ahead economically became more about connections to the state, patronage.
Less about merit or market forces.
Increasingly so.
Okay, and after the 1979 revolution, promises of economic justice.
That was the promise. The reality, though, as the article describes it, is that large parts of the economy fell under the control of these big, opaque foundations, boneyards, plus the military-industrial complex, networks linked to the clergy.
Not exactly a level playing field.
Far from it. And then you add distorting factors like sanctions, war, political isolation. These created incentives for corruption, entrenched clientelism rewarding loyalty over competence.
So what does economic life look like inside Iran today, based on this?
Highly fragmented. A huge informal sector, persistent high inflation, job insecurity is rampant, widespread state financial mismanagement. It's a tough picture.
But are there bright spots?
Yeah.
Innovation.
Yes, the article does point that out. Pockets of innovation, resilience, especially among young people, women, in tech startups, the gig economy, people finding ways despite the barriers.
But the core problem remains.
The lack of stable, fair, transparent ways for most people to get ahead. No clear pathways for upward mobility based on effort or talent.
And this economic hardship, it fuels protests.
Absolutely. The article highlights this disconnect between daily struggles and state policy as a major driver. Protests aren't just about abstract rights. They're rooted in material needs, demands for dignity, fairness, economic inclusion. That's economic citizenship.
Got it. Now back to the diaspora. Economically, they're quite active globally, aren't they?
Oh, incredibly robust economic presence. Entrepreneurs, academics, professionals, investors, including funding media and advocacy related to Iran.
And they operate with more freedom, transparency.
Generally, yes. More global access. And they play a vital role sending remittances back home, funding projects, supporting culture.
But again, the author draws a distinction between this diaspora activity and the economic society inside Iran.
A very pointed one. While these flows are real and meaningful, they happen largely outside Iran's formal economic system, its labor markets, tax system, production cycle.
So you can't just equate them with participating in the internal economy.
That's the argument. It creates what the article calls a parallel economic space.
Parallel, meaning connected but separate.
Exactly. Connected by sentiment, solidarity, money flows, but fundamentally detached from the systemic realities facing people working and doing business inside Iran.
And the article suggests some diaspora funding might even reinforce this separation.
Yeah, it raises the possibility that funding, say, political media without a clear path to impact inside might create a feedback loop where symbolic influence becomes a substitute for tackling the actual structural economic problems within the country. It doesn't change the incentives on the ground.
So the bottom line on economic citizenship, according to this source,
it has to be local. Real economic dignity means earning, owning, investing, innovating within a fair, predictable system inside Iran.
Diaspora support is essential.
Essential support, inspiration, relief. But it can't substitute for the hard work of rebuilding inclusive, transparent economic institutions inside the country.
Okay, so we've looked at the three spheres, civic, political, economic. The article paints a picture of unique, often tough evolutionary path inside Iran for each one.
Yeah, shaped by movements for reform and justice, but always bumping up against authoritarianism, external pressures, internal divisions.
Yet, despite all that, the desire for dignity, participation, fairness. that remains a powerful force inside.
Absolutely. It animates everyday life. Civic actors find ways, political dissent finds creative outlets. Just surviving economically is often a demand for justice.
And the diaspora's role in all this, preserving memory, amplifying voices, providing platforms, that's crucial.
Undeniably essential on the global stage.
But the author's core distinction is key here, isn't it? The diaspora activity, however valuable, mostly operates outside Iran's formal institutions.
That's the critical takeaway. It leads to fundamental differences in experience and impact. Civic efforts outside are freer, but less tied to immediate risk. Political speech is louder globally, but lacks mechanisms for change inside. Economic help is vital, but structurally detached.
So the lines are blurred culturally, digitally.
But not institutionally. That's the crux. Real participation, the kind that transforms systems, requires being embedded in those systems of consequence and accountability. Physical location isn't the only factor, but institutional embeddedness is key.
Which brings us to the end game, sort of. Reclaiming this idea of Iranian citizenry as a unifying force. The article argues it can't just be about nostalgia or slogans.
No, or relying on outsiders. It argues that the shared identity has to be built painstakingly from the lived realities of people inside Iran.
The ones building local trust, taking political risks, enduring economic hardship daily.
Exactly. They are the foundation. And this isn't about excluding the diaspora. No, it's framed as an invitation to a deeper, more honest, more accountable partnership with those inside.
But there's a major obstacle identified, not institutional, but psychological.
Yes. The author uses a strong term, the virus of prejudice.
Wow. What does that mean?
It refers to this ingrained tendency towards exclusion, rivalry, factionalism that constantly threatens to divide Iranians inside and out. This virus makes people lose sight of collective goals and compete over who's more righteous, more patriotic.
Across all spheres. Civic, political, economic.
Across the board. And the author insists this pattern has to be named and actively challenged, because no institutional fix will work if this underlying psychological barrier isn't addressed first.
So, against that difficult backdrop, Hessami's call for a grassroots effort to build a democratic alternative. It becomes more than just politics.
It's presented as a civic imperative, a fundamental need. It's an urgent call for all Iranians, wherever they are, to consciously invest in a different culture.
A culture of participation, responsibility, ethical dialogue.
Yes. To choose to act as citizens working together, not just as partisans pointing fingers or spectators watching from the sidelines.
Because the ultimate truth here is, citizenship isn't just given.
It's practiced every single day.
And where does that practice begin?
Wherever people gather physically or virtually to actually listen to each other, build things together, disagree respectfully, and imagine a shared future beyond geography or ideology, that's where it starts.
So this deep dive has taken us through these complex layers, civic, political, economic, and Hessami's challenging idea about uniting them through a practiced Iranian citizenry.
Yeah, highlighting both the potential and the very real obstacles.
And that key distinction the author makes between acting about Iran from outside and being truly embedded in its structures and struggles, that feels like a really crucial insight.
It helps understand the different dynamics where real transformative agency might lie according to this perspective.
And understanding that distinction, the author's take on it. It's pretty vital for anyone trying to make sense of news about Iran or the complexities of change.
Definitely gives you a framework to think with.
And it leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty powerful question to chew on, building right off the author's analysis. Given this virus of prejudice, this psychological barrier of exclusion and rivalry that was discussed, how can individuals, you, us, anyone, inside or outside Iran, how can we actively spot and challenge those divisive instincts in ourselves? In our own interactions, our own communities.
Right. How does that idea of citizenship as practiced, grounded in empathy, responsibility, respectful dialogue, how does that actually begin today, right where you are listening to this?
Thank you for listening to the Iran 1400 Project podcast. The Iran 1400 Project invites scholars, experts, and intellectuals to share their assessment of the evolution of institutions and ideas during the past 100 years to inspire a vision of Iran in the 1400s. If you found today's episode thought-provoking, be sure to subscribe, share, and continue the conversation. For more content and upcoming events, visit Iran1400.org. Until next time, stay engaged, stay informed, and stay hopeful.